The old-time clock coughed 17 people back into existence. 1 second, my son Evan was smiling for a photographer beside the factory entrance, his hand resting on the brass lever as if he were about to start a harmless museum display. The next second, the clock began to grind. Something snapped behind the face, the lower panel flew open, and a stack of yellowed punch cards shot across the polished concrete floor. Nobody moved at first, then a card slid against my shoe. The date printed across the top was November 18th, 1999. I did not need to bend down to know what was written on it. I had filled in the department number myself. I had watched the man whose name was on that card die 27 years earlier. Franklin Dwyer, maintenance, night shift. At the factory entrance, a plaque already told visitors what had happened that night. According to the official record, Frank had entered the West finishing room alone, restarted equipment without authorization, and caused the explosion that killed him. The plaque also said I had risked my life entering the smoke and pulling 6 trapped employees to safety from an adjacent wing. My name was printed in larger letters than Frank's. Evan picked up a second card, then a third. Everyone carried the same date. Everyone showed a punch-out time of 10:02 p.m. The explosion happened at 11:17. The museum director counted the cards twice. 17, she said. There were 17 names that the official report said had not been inside the factory. My son looked from the cards to the plaque, then to me. "Dad," he said, "why were these hidden in the clock?" I was 71 years old when that machine finally kept a record more honestly than I had. My name is Thomas Mercer. For 22 years, I supervised the night shift at Mercer Ridge Automotive Components outside Anderson, Indiana. I started there loading steel blanks and ended up responsible for 53 people, 4 stamping presses, a wash line, and the promise that every worker who walked through my doors would walk back out. On the night of the explosion, I broke that promise before anything caught fire. The plant closed in 2014 and sat abandoned beside the railroad tracks for 10 years. Where I saw rust and lawsuits, Evan saw Indiana history. He spent 4 years planning the Mercer Ridge Museum of Industry. The centerpiece was supposed to be the story of the explosion, not Frank's story, mine. Newspaper photographs showed me after the blast, my face black with soot. 6 workers were hospitalized. I carried 2 out and guided 4 through a loading bay. The mayor gave me a medal and the company gave me a framed certificate for valor. Evan grew up beneath that certificate. He was 18 in 1999. He remembered seeing me at the hospital wrapped in a silver emergency blanket while reporters waited nearby. In his mind, that night explained who his father was. Evan's proposal called Mercer Ridge, a tradition of responsible manufacturing, worker loyalty, and courage in crisis. The state awarded $2.4 million and former employees donated hard hats, photographs, and tools. I donated the framed certificate. I nearly refused to donate the time clock. It had hung inside the employee entrance since 1968, a gray metal box with a heavy steel lever. Evan wanted visitors to slide replica cards into it and hear the clunk that had started and ended thousands of shifts. "It makes the history feel personal," he said. I told him the mechanism was probably seized. He found a retired clock repairman named Wesley Park who cleaned the gears, replaced the power cord, and mounted it at child height. Wesley noticed that the rear drum dragged when it turned, but he assumed old grease was causing resistance. He asked whether he could take the machine apart completely. I said no. I told him original equipment lost value when you disturbed it too much. Evan repeated that explanation to the museum board because he trusted me. The test was supposed to approve the exhibit for opening weekend. Instead, 17 real cards fell onto the floor. The museum director was a woman named Dr. Lena Ortiz. She had spent 6 months checking the claims printed on every wall. I watched her put on cotton artifact gloves and arrange the cards by employee number. Frank's card was there. So were cards for Linda Carver, Samuel Reed, Otis Bell, Cheryl Watkins, and the other people I had pulled through the smoke. There were 11 more belonging to workers the newspapers had never mentioned. One of them belonged to a woman standing 10 feet away. Linda had come to donate her old safety glasses. She was 64 by then, with white hair and a scar climbing from her collar to her left ear. When Lena read her name, Linda lowered herself onto a bench. "I wondered where those went," she said. Evan stared at her. "You knew about the cards?" Linda looked at me. "Your father told us they never existed." That was when the photographer stopped taking museum pictures and started recording evidence. Lena locked the employee entrance and called the state fire marshal's office. Evan asked everyone to remain calm. He kept saying there had to be a clerical explanation, although 17 punch cards had just emerged from a place no clerk could have put them by accident. I sat beneath the plaque that called me a hero. Investigator Marisol Vega arrived after noon. She photographed the cards, then asked Wesley to open the clock in front of her. Behind the number drum was a narrow service cavity. In 1999, I had wrapped the cards in a clear parts bag, flattened them with my palm, and pushed them behind that drum with a screwdriver. The bag had split as the restored gears began turning. The teeth caught the cards and fed them out one by one. Marisol asked who had access to the clock after the explosion. Linda answered before I did. "Thomas did." My son turned toward me. "Is that true?" "Yes." "Did you put them in there?" For 27 years, I had imagined police officers asking me that question. I had imagined Frank's widow asking it and my wife asking it before she died. I had never imagined Evan would be the one holding the evidence. "Yes," I said. The old factory went quiet in a way it never had when it was operating. In November of 1999, Mercer Ridge had one contract keeping the plant alive. We made stamped brackets used in steering columns for a truck assembly line in Fort Wayne. A run of 1,200 brackets had failed inspection because residue from the wash line contaminated the protective coating. If replacement parts did not leave our dock by 6 the next morning, the customer could shut down an assembly line and charge us for every lost minute. At 9:30 that evening, plant manager Curtis Vale came to my office. The regular night shift ended at 10. Curtis told me the insurance inspectors were coming the following week. The company had already exceeded its overtime budget and headquarters would not approve another hour. Then he set the failed shipping report on my desk. "Find a way," he said. I knew what he meant, even though he was careful not to say it. Indiana law required us to pay hourly employees for every minute we controlled their time. Company policy required written authorization for overtime. Safety rules required at least 2 maintenance workers and an active line supervisor whenever the wash and dry tunnel operated after the scheduled shift. I had 17 people who knew how to clean, inspect, and repack that order. Most of them needed the money badly enough that they would have accepted paid overtime. None of them could afford to risk being labeled uncooperative. At 9:50, I gathered them beside the time clock. I said the company needed one last push. I told them to clock out at 10, return to the West finishing room, and stay until the shipment was ready. I said I would make sure they received comp time later. That promise was illegal, and I never kept it. Frank Dwyer challenged me in front of everyone. Frank was 58, a maintenance mechanic with hands so scarred that he wore his wedding ring on a chain. He knew the exhaust fan above the drying tunnel had tripped twice that week. The solvent monitor was waiting for a replacement sensor, and maintenance had tagged the line for restricted operation. "That room should be shut down," he said. I told him the wash solution was water-based. He said the coating remover we were using on the rejected parts was not. I told him we only needed 90 minutes. Frank looked at the workers standing behind him and said, "Then put the overtime on paper." I should have ended the shift. Instead, I reminded him that layoffs were coming in December. I never directly threatened his job. I did something more useful to a coward. I let him understand that refusing me could put somebody's name on a list. At 10:02, all 17 employees punched out. Then they followed me back onto the floor. You may hear that they stayed voluntarily, or that every supervisor in those days bent the rules when a shipment was late. I used those excuses for years. The truth is simpler. When the man who controls your schedule mentions layoffs, a request becomes an order. We divided the work. 10 employees hand-cleaned and inspected brackets at tables near the loading side. 6 repacked finished parts. Frank worked at the dry tunnel control cabinet, trying to keep the exhaust system running. I moved between the floor and shipping office, calling Curtis with updates he later swore he never received. At 10:48, the exhaust alarm sounded. Frank shut down the conveyor. I saw him tape a red warning tag across the start switch. I removed it. That detail did not appear in any report for 27 years. I told Frank to bypass the automatic cycle and run the fan manually. He refused. We argued beside the cabinet while workers waited with racks of wet parts. Frank said vapor was collecting in the dryer housing. I said we were 20 minutes from finishing. He called me a fool. I said, get it running. Frank opened the control cabinet. He did not start the conveyor. Later investigators assumed he had because his body was found near the switch. Linda saw what actually happened. Frank was testing the fan relay when the dryer igniter cycled without warning. Vapor inside the housing flashed. The first blast lifted the metal access panels. The second blew out the west room windows and dropped part of the ceiling. The lights went black. I remember the pressure striking my chest. I remember landing beneath a packing table with my ears ringing and warm blood running into my left eye. Then people began screaming. The loading side exit was blocked by a twisted conveyor rack. Fire spread along plastic parts bins. The emergency lights failed because their battery cabinet had been removed during renovations and never replaced. I crawled toward the voices. Samuel Reed was on the floor with a broken ankle. I dragged him by the straps of his overalls until Linda helped me lift him. We found Cheryl Watkins behind a fallen inspection table. Otis Bell had burns on both hands and could not see through the smoke. 3 others were trapped near the loading bay because the power door would not open. I knew there was a manual chain behind the south column. I climbed over the bent conveyor, pulled the chain, and raised the door high enough for people to crawl beneath it. 10 employees escaped without my help. I brought 6 out or showed them the way. Frank never left the west room. The fire department found him at 1:36 in the morning, 6 feet from the control cabinet. The coroner said the blast likely killed him before the smoke could. At the hospital, Curtis Vale sat beside my bed before the police interviewed me. He already knew the 17 workers had clocked out. The electronic gate log had been disabled for repairs and the security guard had left at 10. The punch cards were the only simple record proving who remained. Curtis told me the company's liability policy excluded deliberate wage violations connected to an accident. If investigators learned that employees had been ordered to work off the clock, the insurer might deny coverage. The company could collapse. Hundreds of day shift workers could lose their jobs. The injured employees might receive nothing because there would be no company left to pay them. Then he said Frank had no family depending on a Mercer Ridge paycheck. That was not true. Frank had a wife, Diane, and a daughter in college. Curtis meant that Frank was dead and could no longer contradict us. He was maintenance, Curtis said. He was authorized to be there. Nobody else was. I asked what would happen to the others. He said the company would cover their medical care if they described the injuries as occurring during evacuation from a small after-hours maintenance fire. I knew the story made no sense. I also knew Linda was waiting for surgery, Samuel had no health insurance outside the plant, and 6 families were asking whether their paychecks would continue. Curtis leaned closer. You saved them, Tom. Let the company save everybody else. I agreed. The next afternoon, I returned to the employee entrance while firefighters were still working in the west room. Smoke had stained the ceiling, water covered the floor. The time cards remained in their rack because payroll had not collected them. I removed 17 cards. I could not burn them in the plant. Too many people were nearby. I could not take them home because my wife sometimes emptied my pockets before washing my work clothes. So I loosened the back of the clock, pushed the cards behind the drum, and tightened the screws. I intended to retrieve them later. Within a month, lying had become the official version of events. Removing the cards felt more dangerous than leaving them hidden. The injured workers signed settlements. Each received medical coverage, 6 months of wages, and a confidentiality agreement. The other 10 received small retention bonuses. The company told them that any admission of unauthorized work could void the settlement and cost their co-workers their jobs. I signed a statement saying I smelled smoke from the shipping office, entered the west room, and found employees who had rushed in from the break area after the blast. Linda refused to sign the first version. Curtis met with her while she was still bandaged and reminded her that her husband worked on the day shift. She signed the second. Frank could sign nothing. The fire investigator found that the dryer had been started manually after a safety shutdown. The missing red tag Frank's position by the controls in our statements led to one conclusion. Frank Dwyer had entered the factory alone to conduct an unauthorized repair and negligently energized the equipment. Diane Dwyer sat across from me at the county hearing when that finding was announced. She asked whether Frank had seemed distracted in the days before the explosion. I told her no. She asked whether he had ever ignored a safety tag. I told her I had never seen him do it. Both answers were technically true. Then she took my hands and thanked me for trying to reach him. I let her. The insurer paid, the company survived, and I was promoted to production superintendent. Because I had saved 6 people from a danger I helped create, the town decided I was a hero. That word followed me everywhere. It appeared in the newspaper every anniversary. It appeared beside my photograph in the factory lobby. When I retired, Evan gave a speech about courage being what a man did when nobody else could act. I wanted to tell him then. I wanted to tell my wife, Margaret, every time she polished the mayor's medal before a company dinner. But confession would not have restored Frank. It would have endangered the settlements and pensions people had built their lives around. At least that was what I told myself. The truth was that each year of silence gave me more to lose. By the time the cards fell from the clock, Curtis had died. Margaret had died. Frank had been buried for almost 27 years beneath a stone that called him a devoted husband and father, while a state report called him the sole cause of an industrial death. Investigator Vega asked me to make a recorded statement in the old payroll office. Evan insisted on sitting beside me. I told her everything: the urgent order, the unpaid work, the failed exhaust alarm, the red tag I removed, the instruction I gave Frank, and the cards I hid. Linda confirmed the argument at the control cabinet. Within 2 days, 9 surviving workers had contacted the investigator. Some remembered more than others. All remembered clocking out and returning to work. Evan said almost nothing during my statement. When Marisol left the room, he walked to the window overlooking the factory floor. The grant application called this plant a model of responsible manufacturing, he said. It wasn't. I wrote that. You didn't know. He kept his back to me. I knew enough. Evan opened his laptop and showed me a scanned document from the Indiana Department of Labor. It was a 2001 index of unresolved claims. One line referred to Mercer Ridge Automotive, 17 anonymous employees, off-clock work, and an incident dated November 18, 1999. The underlying files had been marked confidential after settlement. Evan found the index while researching the grant. He had removed it from his source list. Evan was afraid disclosing it would reduce the grant or turn the exhibit from innovation to labor abuse, so he treated the index as an unverified rumor. I thought somebody filed a wage complaint after the accident, he said. I didn't know there were cards. I didn't know about Frank. But you knew the story might not be clean. He finally looked at me. I knew asking one more question might cost us the building. For the first time that day, I saw how much of me was in my son. The museum board suspended the opening, and the state froze the remaining grant money. Newspapers ran photographs of the cards beneath headlines about hidden workers and a disgraced hero. Diane Dwyer was 80 years old when Marisol brought her a copy of Frank's time card. She asked to see me. We met in the fellowship room of her church. Her daughter, Rebecca, sat beside her with the original fire report in a blue folder. I had not seen either woman in more than 20 years. Diane placed the copied card between us. Frank punched out at 10:02, she said. Yes. But you ordered him to stay? Yes. And when the machine became dangerous, he shut it down? Yes. Her voice never rose. Who removed the warning tag? I said. I did. Rebecca covered her mouth. Diane looked down at the card for a long time. Then she asked the question I deserved. When people called you a hero, did you ever once say his name? I tried to remember every ceremony, interview, banquet, and anniversary. Sometimes I had said we lost a good mechanic. Sometimes I had called the explosion tragic. I had never told anyone Frank tried to stop the line. No, I said. Diane nodded as if I had confirmed something she already knew. Then you didn't only hide his card, she said. You stood where his name should have been. She and Rebecca filed a petition asking the state to vacate the original cause finding. They did not sue me that week. They did not need to. The petition placed my signed 1999 statement beside my new confession and asked which version the state intended to honor. Former workers began choosing sides. Samuel Reed told reporters I had saved his life and that no document could change the fact that I crawled through fire for him. Linda said both things had to remain true. I had dragged Samuel out and I had used the threat of layoffs to keep them inside. Others feared a reopened case might threaten their old settlements or pensions. Evan wanted me to stop speaking publicly until attorneys settled the consequences. His lawyer said my recorded statement to the investigator was enough. A public confession could cause the state to cancel the museum grant permanently. It could expose Evan to allegations that he misrepresented the application. It could give national reporters a story that would define the museum before it opened. Let the process work, Evan said. Those were the same words Curtis had used after the explosion. I asked Evan whether he planned to correct the grant application. He said his attorney was preparing a narrow amendment. Will it include the labor index you removed? He did not answer. The museum board scheduled a public meeting to decide whether the project should continue. More than 300 people filled the old assembly hall. Former employees sat on folding chairs beneath the crane rails. Diane and Rebecca sat in the front row. The 17 cards lay in individual protective sleeves on a table beside the time clock. The board expected me to read a short statement drafted by Evan's attorney. It said I regretted errors in the historical record and supported further review. I folded that statement and put it in my pocket. When I reached the microphone, the room was so quiet I could hear the old clock ticking behind me. I said my name and job title. Then I read all 17 names. I described how I had ordered those workers to clock out, how I had used fear of layoffs to make them stay, and how I had removed Frank's warning tag. I told them Frank did not start the equipment recklessly. He opened the cabinet because I ordered him to get the line running. Then I explained the rescue. I did pull 6 people from that room, I said, but I only had to save them because I helped put them in danger. Courage after an explosion does not erase cowardice before it. I admitted hiding the cards to protect the company's insurance and my own future. I admitted accepting a medal while Frank's family carried the blame. Then Evan walked onto the stage. For one hopeful second, I thought he had come to stand beside me. He asked for the microphone. Evan told the board about the labor claim index. He said he had excluded it from the grant materials because he believed it was unverified, but also because he knew it could delay or defeat the project. He handed the board chair a corrected disclosure with the omitted page attached. I didn't create my father's lie, he said, but I found a loose thread and cut it because I wanted the story to hold together. The board did not applaud either of us. Diane Dwyer stood after public comments began. She said she did not want the factory demolished, and she did not want Frank turned into a perfect man merely because Thomas Mercer had failed him. She wanted the official report corrected. She wanted the museum to teach visitors how respectable institutions persuaded ordinary people to protect them. And she wanted every employee who had been erased from that night restored to the record. If this place opens with one hero, she said, then it is still lying. The state fire marshal reopened the cause review. Engineers examined surviving photographs, maintenance logs, and the damage control assembly stored in an evidence warehouse. They could not reconstruct every physical event after so many years, but they found enough to withdraw the claim that Frank acted alone or without authorization. The revised finding documented 17 concealed workers, inadequate ventilation, a disabled safety system, and supervisory pressure to restart restricted equipment. Frank had been diagnosing the exhaust failure under instruction. His name was removed from the line marked responsible party. No criminal charge followed. The legal deadlines had expired, evidence was lost, and Curtis was dead. Some people called that mercy. Diane called it a legal fact, not forgiveness. The insurance company pursued no recovery from retired workers. The Labor Department issued a historical determination acknowledging the off-clock shift and the unresolved claims. A private fund supported by the former corporate owner and museum donors paid the surviving employees the overtime they had been denied with interest. The checks mattered, but they were not justice. Frank's share went to a scholarship in his name for industrial maintenance students. The state allowed the museum to keep the grant, but only after Evan resigned as project director for 6 months, the board hired an independent labor historian and every disputed claim was rewritten. Opening day moved back 1 full year. During that year, I visited the factory every Thursday. I answered questions, identified people in photographs, and showed the historian where the warning tags were stored. When my memory conflicted with another worker's, both versions went into the notes. Evan and I spoke carefully at first. He was angry that my confession nearly destroyed the project. I was angry that he had repeated my instinct to hide inconvenient evidence. Neither of us had the right to use the other man's failure as protection from his own. One afternoon, we stood beneath the repaired loading door. Evan asked why I had risked my life after spending the previous hour risking everybody else's. I told him I did not know. That answer bothered him, so I tried again. Before the blast, danger was a number on a production report. It was a warning tag I could peel away, a rule I could call impractical, a worker I could pressure because I needed a shipment completed. After the blast, danger had Samuel's voice and Linda's burned face. It was close enough to touch. I acted when the cost was visible. Real responsibility would have meant acting while the cost was still easy to ignore. If you are deciding whether saving 6 lives made me a hero, do not decide until you count all 17 people I ordered to stay, and the one man who never came home. A brave act can be real without making the person who performed it innocent. The Mercer Ridge Museum of Industry opened on November 18th, 1 year later than planned. There was no ribbon-cutting photograph of me. Evan and Diane cut the ribbon together. Linda stood beside them wearing the same safety glasses she had once intended to donate to a celebration of flawless service. The employee entrance looked almost exactly as it had in 1999. The gray time clock hung on the brick wall. Wesley repaired the bent drum but left the scratches inside the service cavity. Visitors could see them through a clear panel. No replica cards were provided. The 17 original cards rested in a sealed glass case beneath the clock. Beside each card was a name, a job, and a short account recorded by the worker or the worker's family. Linda Carver, quality inspector; Samuel Reed, packer; Otis Bell, forklift operator; Cheryl Watkins, line worker; Franklin Dwyer, maintenance mechanic. All 17 names appeared in the same size. Mine appeared on a separate panel titled Night Supervision and Accountability. It described the people I rescued. It also described the order I gave, the tag I removed, the statement I signed, and the evidence I hid. The mayor's medal was displayed there too. I asked Diane whether it should be removed. She said no. People should have to look at both, she told me. Across from the clock, the original hero plaque lay flat inside another case. A label explained why it had been taken down. Evan wanted to destroy it, but Diane insisted that hiding a false history would only repeat the lesson. On opening day, I watched a group of high school students enter the exhibit. Their teacher asked why employees would clock out and keep working. Linda, who had volunteered as a guide, answered before I could. Because losing a job can sound more dangerous than breaking a rule, she said, until the rule is the thing keeping you alive. One student stopped in front of Frank's card and read the revised finding twice. Another counted the names beneath the clock with her finger. 17. For 27 years, that clock held the evidence of the worst order I ever gave. I thought I had hidden 17 cards to save a factory. What I really hid were 17 choices, 17 witnesses, and 17 people whose fear had made my reputation possible. The museum did not erase the night I entered the smoke. It finally showed what happened before I did. My framed certificate still says I demonstrated extraordinary courage during the Mercer Ridge explosion. Beneath it, the new label contains a sentence I wrote myself. Thomas Mercer rescued 6 workers from a fire after ordering an off-clock shift that placed 17 employees in danger. Some visitors stand there for a long time waiting for the exhibit to tell them which half of that sentence matters more. It never does. Then they hear the time clock strike, look down, and read the names that should have been there all along.